Good morning, everybody. Minasan, ohayou gozaimasu. A big welcome to you all to this session on inclusive and holistic resilience, findings from the World Risk Poll. Over the next hour, we're going to launch from Himeji a really important resource that is significant in perhaps two ways. The Lloyd's Register Foundation has turned its back very respectfully, as it were, on the global community of risk experts and spent the last 2 years consulting the real owners of risk, the communities, and asked them really about how they feel about their ability to cope with protecting themselves from disasters, their level of household savings, their assessment and trust in government and disaster management services, their assessment of other government services. So this is a really important initiative, both in terms of what it does, using really the currency of trust, sentiment, household capacity, things that actually our community is normally less interested in. This is often the domain of, if you think about it, politicians and the media. So this is very special. And secondly, this is significant in terms of the scale, the reach, the ambition of this work. So Lloyd's Register Foundation have cast a really wide net over 142 countries and territories and created a statistically robust and valid data set that we're going to explore today. Before we do so, however, we're going to watch a film. Lloyd's Register Foundation have had the foresight to encourage us to ground our thinking in a lived reality, in the lived reality of exactly the kind of community that it has been polling through Gallup. I think many of you know Gallup, the global polling company. Exactly that kind of community is represented in this film. So we'll watch the film first, as I think others of us arrive, and then we'll dive into the data with the Lloyd's Register Foundation. A household matter, housekeeping matter. I believe the wonders of AI are bringing us digital streaming, both text and audio. So if you do want to point your cameras at the QR code, you will get interpretation from English into Japanese and French, should you wish it. So this is the film. It's about 10 minutes long.
We get excess flooding at this community here. The first experience I get, and then around then 1 o'clock. But like I hear people in the talk now though, but me feel no more something. I one day when they sleep weak, not knowing that once I don't take over the whole community. I see no more the chair don't float, the freezer they dance and that, the other rubber they all they dance up the water. So like I go first I sit down first, now I calm too, before I go damage myself. Me picking some of my water now say patience, water don't come in all of it. No can make so you can't damage yourself. Like I put the meter off, all the electrical appliances I put it all off.
In my community, I don't experience flash flood, where intensive rain can come, where then gutter then can flop, where it meets with the high tide, what we can call just speaking that local language when we understand, where it can meet up, it is scatter the car within the community. So doing that, they can limit to movement. They like sometimes they pull property them, If the way they go school, the property then can soak. Then the one the way they do business, it can also soak the business, the way can make for that moment the community can stand still.
Yes, women are the most vulnerable people when it comes to climate change. Lord can now say the picking and they sleep. Don't like water flop inside us. When the picking and the emperor. And the mama they are like mama instead of the papa. And more of the mama than the more killing us because like as locally the papa they don't go fail. So in terms of any disaster, now we more the vulnerable.
We do man the Facebook thing. Once you get saw the woman then, where maybe then people and some man can injured or whatsoever. Remember, whose hospital you go to where community no get the hospital. Who say go pull money for la go treat this person.
Don't take an say, don't take you last money, don't go buy markets for cancel. You put them. Don't rain just cut out the cam. That rain away can not pull you market. You say that market away you buy not for water, not for soak. Again, it don't put you behind because like you know get other side for go pull that money.
So this gutter one at the Fiso. Now the gutter where they serve as the boundary between Kolatik and Mafembe. Now in this, as this at the earlier shown, and in cut from up yonder, take down we can join at the sea. You find out say alongside we get an hanging toilet when a concrete one where they can tap the drainage. So you find out say if high rains can we meet up with the sea level rise, possibility go there for let water go inside the toilets. Whether not going to make the person also exposed to hazard or risk. The way they think about unsafe drinking water is very common within the community because the pipe, even the pipe-borne water the way we get, now the formal area, they can cut the pipe then for more. So we can get like that kind of rains. If the pipe is not left open, if the water pass inside that pipe, they then pump open during that period, the water they become contaminated. Then I also experience extreme heat weather condition because like as you find out say climate change, now the way how the atmosphere or the weather they change. So they experience that kind of smack heat. And especially the outside midday, the place to the corner. Sometimes even if I light or put fan on, I won't forget that kind of cold breeze, it is send back that hot breeze.
We dey work in 72 slums areas. We get the hilltop and the seaside. Like for the seaside, mostly their own disasters, their own demand, then are more of flooding and fire. Like we get various communities them for every year they experience fire. Like for the Susan's Bay, Kuru Bay, so in the hilltop community like them Moiba, Duazak and tree planting. Themselves they experience until like mudslide and other stuff there. And for my own community, Duazak, the disaster we don't experience more like I say, na landslide like na the Spain communities. Like one side be the way like then be cut off, people and they go then dig, then build houses then this. So like the hill before them and houses then be go, structures then be goes, but it be rather unfortunate where life may not be lost, but properties they all be damaged because of the railway cuts. You know they notify where something where incidents will happen, you know get anybody where they notify.
Well, some of the things that they are the problem in this community also are collect on. One, the poor waste disposal. Two, the banking, the illegal banking. Because as I talk to you so now, right now people are still in bank. Three, the deforestation. When cut stick, you get some compound themselves, they don't get stick.
The sand they carry warm and we more wedding assistant a pan body than I do with it. And you get at which way pan, ennoble sand.
So final say where the mangrove be there today, the kind way how the heat they so now not also be there forced them. But because of the don't cut them and go there, they experience the smack heat now. Because of the lack of recognition from the central government, landowners and they even afraid for invest in building standard houses there. There's even some man also in space there, the topography of the community, not the able for of the soil, not the able for allow them for make a bela kind concrete structure. Then like some man they even afraid for invest because of the threat of eviction. Because when they take and say something where you don't can take all the life savings, you put them a build a standard house, at any time government will come pull here.
We try for kind of the communities there and make sure say we form structures there, we put structures there in place. We are the community disaster management committees. But since we form them structures then they in terms of response, any emergency will happen, then can come and respond as community level, where they can come, they make sure say they help people out and do some other things, and we train them. Well, first of all, train them in terms of search and rescue, because you know the able for go rescue person where you self not get the kind knowledge you need for train them. So one we dey plant trees and also we dey try for restore mangrove na the Aberdeen Creek wey from Medina take and Colastic 6 zones them, and also we try for plant trees around the different catchments them. So like resilience officer we try for apply for short opportunity, because we know say people dey suffer due to deforestation, so try for make follow we do afforestation so people no go dey suffer, because where we dey consider the rate at which we sand dey warm, e very difficult for some of we where they live na them communities there. So we be taught and fit say because some community livelihood more be depend on that mangrove, like where mangrove be they get that cockle picking, they cockle they come, and the fish and they even they breed among the mangrove, the fishing livelihood and all that stuff, it be so active in the community. But since when they cut them mangrove, then they be say community people and they always they cry livelihood activities. So we be taught and fit say for restore mangrove, then be good ideas for them and we.
One way I dey prepared for respond towards the disaster issues the way they happen in our community. First of all, I get the awareness on how for do things there we will make our prepare better. And because I get that awareness here, we can do like that skills or knowledge sharing to other people that within the community. The community through sensitization, awareness raising, community engagement then we can also do community cleaning. Then we also get the capacity for respond to disaster during the time when it take place. And after the disaster, we can also go door to door, we do that psychosocial counseling. Then we can also give small personal support that we'll get to other people there. Then like if it happen now to we directly, we don't already know now how for cope with the issue. The best thing, when see water flow beside you, just lock the water and go fence inside my and safe aside. Until the water go, you can't avoid you carpet now, you chair and do for dry there for clean. We don't know say sometimes we will seek external support from some of the partners they will work with. But if any provision not in place for that, we'll be able for cope with things we said. We learn for sharing story. So the big one they will have power. So that this story will influence them, and they will able to listen to it for them to do what thing will better win our community. The importance of collecting data and that, they make you know the actual problem when they affecting the community. Well, let's see we go need for them go they support me so that we will continue for doing what we can do so. Because we as CDMC, we need support.
So the Freetown flood fighters of Sierra Leone is covered by the World Risk Poll, but the World Risk Poll also covers approximately 30 other African countries. And I think that in order to give us an overview of the headline results of all 142 countries, I'd like to invite David Reed, the Director of Global Advocacy and Campaigns for the Lloyd's Register Foundation, to navigate us through the headlines, as it were, of this year's World Risk Poll.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Mark. So I'm just going to show you some of the high-level results, and then I'll try and get through it quite quickly so we can have lots of time for questions and discussion. A quick introduction to Lloyd's Register Foundation. We're an independent global charity. We're based in London, but we support work all around the world. The World Risk Poll is one of our sort of flagship programs. We started the World Risk Poll in about 2018, so this is the third iteration of the poll. It takes place every 2 years on a 2-year cycle. It takes a year to collect all the data and a year to analyze and present the data and understand the data. So it's quite a big project. This is poll number 3, the 2024 poll. Data was collected in 2023. It covers 142 countries, around 147,000 people. It's done by Gallup. A lot of the interviews are done in person, and they're done by local experts in each country. So it's statistically very robust. It's nationally representative for all 142 different countries. And the report we're looking at today is the first report in this World Risk Poll, which is all about resilience. This is the second time we've done the resilience module. So we started the resilience module in the 21-22 poll. So now we can look at changes between 21 and 23. We can't quite look at trends yet, but we can certainly look at changes. This gives you an idea of the different questions that we've asked within the resilience index. So, there are lots of different ways of measuring resilience. There's lots of different definitions of resilience. Some people look at the resilience of infrastructure. They look at hard measures. They look at national preparedness indexes. They look at, timing of hazard responses. What we wanted to do was a bit, like we saw in the Freetown film, is we wanted to look at what is real people and local communities' capacity for handling adversity. So we wanted to take more of a human approach to resilience, and we wanted to ask people in all these countries what their sort of personal perceptions of resilience was, what they feel about their level of resilience, but also get input on their experiences of disasters, of adversity, and as well as experience, also understand a little bit about how we can connect some of the harder measures like discrimination or educational level or age or gender with some of their responses on resilience as well. So there's about 10 indicators in the resilience module. You probably can't read these, but these are the 10 questions. They're split into 4 dimensions. So there's a couple of questions that looks at individual resilience. So how people feel they can protect themselves and their families in the event of a disaster. How prepared do they feel? So it's about self-agency. We look at some household attributes. So how long do you think you could survive if there's a disaster and you lost your income? So fairly hard measure. We look at planning, if there's a plan in place for your household. So do you have a plan in place that everybody over the age of 10 in your household knows if there's a disaster? We look at some community aspects. So we try to understand what is community resilience? What is the role of social capital and community cohesion in building resilience? And we look at some things there like, do your neighbors care about you? Do you feel safe? Do you help other people? So aspects of community. And then we look at measures of societal resilience, things like, do you have confidence in your national institutions? Do you feel your government cares about you? So again, some of these are perceptions and feelings. Some of them are more concrete measures about experience and capacity. All of these things are given us a numerical score to make it an index, so they're aggregated up, and we get an overall score for each country that gives us a sense of how resilient is that country in these 4 dimensions. That's what's visualized on the right side over there. So each of the slices that you can see moving is a different country. So the size of the slice gives the overall resilience for that country. So in the green up at the top, we have the countries. Kuwait is the sort of number 1 at the very top the most resilient country, Afghanistan at the bottom, and then in between lots of countries. The different dimensions on those slices are the 4 dimensions, so individual, household, community, and society. And we see some quite surprising results. So if we look at the countries with the highest score in the Resilience Index for 2023-2024, that's what it looks like. So highest and lowest. But actually, this shows a very complex picture. No country is consistently high across the 4 dimensions. So if you look underneath the big aggregate score, the Resilience Index, you see a lot of variation between countries. Every country is different. Some countries might score high, like Sweden, on individual and household, but actually score quite low on community resilience and societal resilience. So each country has a unique resilience profile, and I think that can give us a lot of insights into, how do we work with different countries in building resilience at these different levels in these different dimensions. So if we look at one country, so let's just look at Japan. So Japan comes in the top 3rd overall for resilience, so resilience is pretty high. Interestingly, Japan is very consistent, quite symmetrical across all 4 dimensions, individual, household, community, and societal. All are relatively high, all in the kind of top. No significant change between 21 and 23, so very consistent across time at the moment in Japan. If we have to pull out, an interesting finding for Japan, if we delve into community resilience for Japan, there's quite an interesting result in the question we ask about whether people's neighbors care about them. And Japan actually comes one of the lowest for this. Very different to when we've seen presentations this week of how people respond in Japan during disasters. It seems people have a very high level of community resilience. They seem to really help each other. But the answers we're getting in this question seem to be very, very low. So something interesting there for Japan. If we look at a different country, we look at Sierra Leone, a lower overall resilience score, so in the bottom 3rd of countries. Much more variation now across the 4 different dimensions, and this is more common. In most countries, we see quite a lot of variation in the 4 dimensions of the index. So we might see very high communal and societal and very low individual and household, or vice versa for other countries. So if you take the USA, for example, to contrast, they have very, very high individual resilience and very, very low societal. This is the opposite way around for Sierra Leone. The only big change between 21 and 23 for this one is in societal resilience, a drop from 63 to 55. And that's mainly being driven by this question here about, do you feel your government cares about you? And you can see the difference between 21 and 23. Almost half of the people in Sierra Leone feel their government does not care about them. So maybe we'll get some insights from Francis during the panel discussion about what's happening here. So beneath this data, there are just lots of things, lots of clues it's telling us about what's happening in some of these countries. How does the different dimensions work? What are the relationships between the dimensions? And what's driving resilience? What drives individual resilience or drives community resilience? And how can we understand that to build interventions to actually improve resilience for different countries? That's what we're trying to really understand here. Looking at the overall change in the Resilience Index, overall, between 2021 and the 2023 survey, there wasn't a lot of change in the overall resilience score globally. It stayed about the same. But more countries decreased than increased. So if anything, there was a little decrease overall globally in resilience. But if you look at the different dimensions, there was much more variation. Globally, so these are global figures now, not looking at one country, but looking at all countries, there was a very, very big decrease in the level of individual resilience globally. So people are feeling around the world much less resilient. They're feeling less of a sense of agency, less of a sense of control. This mainly came from the question we asked about, do you feel you can protect yourself and your family in the event of a disaster? And you can see there's a 7-point fall between 2021 and 2023. So what's going on there? What's driving that? What affects our individual resilience globally and in different countries? If you look at the country breakdown and you look at the countries that have had the biggest fall, if you see from the top, if you ignore Algeria, but generally, no country saw a big increase in resilience, in individual resilience. Lots of countries saw a big fall in individual resilience, which is driving the global score. But if you look at the countries there, one country, Morocco, we can explain, major earthquake in September that has caused that result, and that caused a big fall in individual resilience. The other 4 countries are all in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, at the moment, there's the war in Ukraine, so there's local conflict, local instability, there's a lot of political instability. Also, economic factors have a big impact on our individual sense of agency. And inflation there was almost 14% in 2022, 2023. So there was a major cost of living crisis across all of these countries. So this is starting to give us some insights into what's driving individual resilience. If we start to look at other relationships, we can see a really strong correlation here between, so on the x-axis, going along the bottom, we have planning. So do you have a plan in place for your household that all members of your family over the age of 10 know about, along the bottom? And along the top is this individual resilience question, the one about agency. And you can see there's a strong correlation between both these things. So maybe this is telling us actually, if you want to move countries to the right and up, they need to have household plans in place. So the more disaster planning we can encourage in some countries, so if you look at Egypt or Afghanistan, right down at this end, if we could put more disaster plans in place for families in those countries, maybe we can move them up and increase their individual sense of agency, their individual feelings of resilience. So a strong correlation here. Interesting, Philippines, Vietnam, and Cambodia, really way out the top there. So big success story there, but what's happening? It'd be great to really understand what are those countries doing to get this right. Clearly very good at community and family and household disaster planning. They've got their plans in place, but also hugely a sense of individual resilience. So maybe there's something else happening in those countries that we could understand. If we look at Morocco, so another interesting thing that we can see is what is the impact of a disaster on people's different resilience levels, individually, community, societal. And we see different things in different countries. So we all know that generally countries that experience a disaster or multiple disasters or repeated disasters get better. Their planning improves, they're more societally resilient if they experience disasters previously. Morocco in September had a major earthquake, and they're not used to having major earthquakes, unlike the Pacific countries. So this was a huge earthquake, had a devastating effect, large loss of life, huge loss of buildings and landmarks as well. Morocco doesn't regularly have big earthquakes, so this came as a huge shock, a huge surprise, both to the government and communities and individuals. And the biggest impact we see here is a very big reduction in individual resilience, 39 to 24. So it's really affected individuals and people and how they feel about their own resilience and their ability to control things. But actually we see a tiny increase in community and societal resilience has stayed high for Morocco. If we look at New Zealand, where there was major flooding in Auckland, we see the opposite pattern. So Auckland, Wellington, and Canterbury. This also shows that we can break the results down not just by country, but we look at regions within countries. So the World Risk Poll data set, particularly the resilience data, is a very rich data set. It breaks everything down by regions, by countries, by demographics. So there's a lot of data that you're welcome to look at. It's all freely available. It's all on our website that I'll put up at the end. So there's a lot of things you can look at. Here we see increasing distance from the disaster. So Auckland is where it happened. Wellington is quite nearby. Wellington also experienced some severe weather and flooding. Canterbury is on the other island, so didn't experience the same thing. And you see has a slightly different pattern. But what we see here is a very big drop in societal and community resilience, but not much effect on individual resilience, unlike Morocco. So we're starting to see that different disasters and different experiences affect those different resilience dimensions differently. Maybe in Morocco, because people weren't used to it, it affected people individually, but they felt the government and their community responded really well, and they handled it well and they overcame it. Whereas in Auckland, maybe they feel their government ought to be protecting them against flooding, and actually they did very well individually, as individuals, but they feel the government failed or their communities failed. And so there's an opinion here about community and societal resilience. There's also a big section in the survey around early warnings for all. There's a whole chapter on early warning systems. We asked people who had experienced a disaster in the last 5 years, did you receive any kind of early warning? And the results we got were fairly consistent with the 2021 poll. Around 2/3 of people who've experienced a disaster in the last 5 years did receive some early warning. So that's pretty positive. A lot of people are getting early warnings. But 1 in 3 didn't. So at the moment we have early warnings for most. We don't have early warnings for all. In this chapter on early warnings, there's a lot of information about how people receive that information, where did they get the early warnings from, what kind of early warnings work, how did different age groups or different demographics receive the warning. So there's some really interesting information here to try and improve early warnings for all. So I'd encourage you to look at that. One interesting statistic, 3/4 of people who were not warned or did not receive a warning own a mobile phone. So clearly we're not using the technology maybe as well as we could. So lots of insights here for early warnings. I'm going to stop there. We've only really scratched the surface of the data. There's a huge data set here that is freely available. We really need partners and other experts to help us understand what the data is telling us about resilience, about what drives resilience, the relationships between individual resilience, the importance of community cohesion and social capital, the importance of societal resilience as well, and how these things work. So please look at the data. Everything's up there. Contact us, talk to us. I hope you'll ask some questions and help us. Really what we're trying to do is turn this data into actions that will make things better. So we really need, and we have a grant scheme available. Sorry, one last thing. We have funding available for proposals to turn the data into action. So if you have ideas, please contact us. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for that great overview. I'm sure you will have lots of questions, queries, feedback for David, and you will have a chance to do so. But before that, let's hear from our panelists. So Francis and Zoe, do join David up front here, and let's start to really get some feedback from the two of you. I'm putting up the slide on Sierra Leone. Why am I doing that? Because we're fortunate to have Francis Reffel here. Francis is the director of the Center for Dialogue on Human Settlements and Poverty Alleviation, based in Freetown, Sierra Leone, one of the organizations that supported the film we saw right at the beginning. Francis, welcome first of all. I know you had a long journey here. He wasn't even at the opening ceremony to answer the question, how many hours have you been traveling? Because actually he was still traveling. Yes. So Francis, let's have some feedback from you. First of all, there's the film and then there's the data. It's behind you, some of the headlines on Sierra Leone. Do they align? Does the film tell the story of the data, and does the data really reinforce the film? It'd be great to get some feedback from you on that.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Yes, definitely. What's the film and the data are talking? It's actually a reflection of the realities on the ground. You realize that from what the women particularly are saying, that a lot of effort in terms of responding to disaster, lies in their hands. And so essentially what we, working with communities, what we have done over time is to organize, these communities into community-based disaster management committees. And so the women that spoke in the film are actually part of those structures, and they are in their own ways, mobilizing the little resources, coming together, acting together to actually respond in various forms, either as first responders or actually involved in various sensitization in terms of creating awareness within communities to ensure that communities take, the right action when maybe prior or after the occurrence of disaster. Of course, you realize that one critical thing about those settlements is that they are actually trapped in what I refer to as statutory consequences. Those areas, according to the books, are illegal settlements. And so you expect that, if government is planning, those settlements are actually out of those plans, be it planning for disaster, be it for any sustainable kind of plans. And so that situation has actually driven, the kind of persistence, vulnerability of those settlements. And so if you hear from the women, and of course the data is also speaking, I mean, those are the realities. The people are really trapped, in a risk trap. And every year they experience flooding, one way or the other, or in some areas, mudslide and so. So I think there is a lot of correlation between the theme, the data, and the reality.
Thank you, Francis. In the film, there was a section where these really inspirational lady community leaders were talking about some of their advocacy efforts around storytelling. Around advocacy, how do you think you might be able to use this data set with either the Sierra Leonean government or donors? How can this work help you?
Yes, it's very useful. First of all, as an agency working with communities, our approach is actually utilizing data as evidence. The structures that we establish, like the community-based disaster management, are actually a component of the Federation. I think the name showed up, Federation of Urban and Rapport, which is a network of savings group. So one of our approach is actually depending on community data collection. And so we have trained, a good number across the various settlements. Essentially, we say there are about 72 slums in Freetown. So across those communities, we have trained, if you like, community scientists, data collectors. And so they are involved in using digital tools, especially a smartphone, to collect data on household. They also do a lot of risk mapping. And so this data here is also useful in addition to what the local data that we generate. Because at the end of the day, we are training these people as advocates, because to create effective advocacy, it has to be those who actually experience those disasters, and horrible experiences, to share the stories before stakeholders, those in government, local and state, are able to listen. And so when they have the evidence, which we can, link this to what we do also at the same time, it actually creates the kind of impact in terms of stakeholders in government, and other development agencies to respond to those things. So I think this is a very useful data, on top of what we also do.
Thank you. And I think in the interest of disclosure, I should also share with you the fact that my organization is a beneficiary of Lloyd's Register Foundation. We have been working with the data on early warning systems design in the urban space. And one reflection I have for you, Francis, is that I believe you are the national affiliate of Slum Dwellers International. The data is actually disaggregatable at the provincial level as well, which allows a Slum Dwellers International affiliate to say to a national government, you have this problem in our capital city, you have it in Nairobi, but you also have it across the country, and here is the evidence. So I think that is very powerful, yes. Yeah. Zoe, you are a lead disaster risk management specialist for the World Bank, and I think you work quite extensively in the urban space. Give us some feedback on the potential utility of this vast data set that does span those 4 dimensions and has that very particular emphasis on perception, confidence, as well as attributes of capacity and household finance. How useful do you think it can be for the World Bank?
Oh, thank you, Mark, and thank you for having me here today. So as we all know, data-driven decision-making is key. And so at the World Bank, we we work with governments. They are the ones preparing investment programs, for example, resilient infrastructure, focusing on urban resilience, even using community-driven approaches, but always to inform the design, especially given limited resources, right? Because we're talking about prioritization and investment sort of decision-making. You need data, you need exposure data, you have hazard data. We typically use sources such as census data, right? Household survey data, the typical types of data, and then potentially collecting at the local level, like what Francis was talking about, data from communities. But I feel that the World Risk Poll is very unique in the way that it brings this additional dimension, looking at how people perceive risk, because that's also something that's hard to sort of grasp and quantify, and you're not going to get that necessarily from census data, right? But how people perceive risk, their sense of agency, as we were talking about, these 4 different levels of dimensions of resilience. But it gives additional insights, right? To have a dialogue. So if we're already talking about bringing these different data sets together to say, hey, we think, in this community or in this city, flood risk, well, it's not even us, it's actually the government saying we have this problem that we need to solve in terms of, let's say it's flood risk or emergency preparedness at the city level. Then we can use these data to bring in these additional elements to try and give a better understanding of what may be happening beyond just the hard infrastructure or the things we typically discuss when we're talking about project preparation. And what I also like about this is that it's an independent third-party data set that is reputable, and it has over 140 countries, and it's being done over time, so you can kind of benchmark a bit as a country and see. I mean, I know it's not so many years yet, but at least you can kind of get a sense and gauge a little bit with your other data points if you're moving the needle. I hate that term, but I'm going to say it. That and low-hanging fruit. If you're moving the needle on some of the these different resilience challenges that you're trying to solve, either at the community, regional, or city level.
So it brings in additionality. It's important because it comes from a third party. It's statistically robust. I'm thinking about some of the comments that were made in the film from the women saying it's women that suffer disproportionately, and I believe there is actually statistically valid a measurement of in the different dimensions of the resilience of women, and I think it is consistently lower than that of men. How might you take that really critical additional element, how might you take that forward in your program design? Zoe.
So this is a key element that the World Bank and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, also where I work, that we've been working to advance the issue of gender equality in terms of disaster risk management, because as we've seen, as you mentioned, Mark, that a disaster may occur, but the way it affects people, women, girls, men, boys, also persons with disabilities, there's a whole range of intersectionality, right, of how you fit within society and the vulnerabilities that you may have. So those elements drive your vulnerability, depending on your context, right? And we know that women face barriers, especially even before a disaster, right? So they face barriers in terms of economic opportunity, access, the ability to prepare adequately, as we saw from the video. I mean, we heard it directly from the women living in Freetown, so I don't need, it's not only in Freetown, right? This is an issue we see, especially in lower income countries. So what I think, using the World Risk Poll data, one of the key elements that we've seen is, especially when you're trying to design more gender-sensitive or socially inclusive programs, especially there's a gap in sex disaggregated data.
Right.
So it's sometimes we don't know, we have a hard time, or persons with disabilities, we had a session this morning talking about that, and the lack of having that type of disaggregated data to then inform these types of assessments is a big gap. So I think this, of course, well, not perfect, but it definitely helps sort of fill some of those issues in places where you don't have very much data at all on some of those demographics. And then using those data, you can design, there are a lot of ways, and we've seen ways where you can design more, gender-sensitive emergency preparedness, response programs, shelter management, preventing gender-based violence, things like that.
Thank you. Thank you, Zoe. That's really interesting. David, you have a huge team back in London of data analysts, scientists. You have your media team involved in launching the World Risk Poll today. Meantime, here in Himeji, you've been dipping in and out of different sessions. Tell me, have you been connecting any of the sessions and what's been discussed with the World Risk Poll?
It's a really small team, by the way. We're a very small charity. It's about 3 people, so it's not.
Okay.
It's not that big a
Okay.
team.
Right.
Gallup may be a big team. Yeah. So we're quite a small organisation. But yeah, I think one of the things that really interests me is this issue of social capital and community resilience. And I think that the Freetown film really speaks to the fact that while the World Risk Poll result for Sierra Leone was very low for individual resilience, it was very high for community resilience, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the community replace the individual, if you like. Sometimes you need communities to come together, and you need that social capital, and if you have that, you can really withstand adversity and respond really well to disasters. So how do we build that? What's behind that? And I think I've heard some really interesting examples, talks, and data this week already about different elements that help build that. There was a talk on day 1, I think, about the Noto Peninsula earthquake, where they were talking about the importance of local festivals. That they want to bring back local festivals because festivals are really important, particularly for that area, in bringing the community together and developing relationships, perhaps amongst a community that live quite remotely a lot of the time. And I'm sure that's different for different communities. So I think there's something quite interesting there. And the second thing I've noticed is this issue, a lot of sessions about trust, the importance of trust and the relationship between trust of our societal institutions, but also the trust in our community and in our neighbors to handle a disaster. There was another talk I saw yesterday in the trust session that proved a link between trust in the community and trust in the society, and how likely people were to follow an evacuation plan in Japan in the event of flooding. So, really very concrete data about how these things actually impact people's lives and can prevent harm. So I think that's quite an interesting area.
Thank you, David. And while you've been talking, I've been shuffling the slides forward to the early warnings for all slide, and you mentioned trust in evacuation warnings. So I think that's a very nice cue to discuss this slide. And to get a little bit of feedback from our panelists and also the audience. So UN Early Warnings for All, globally ambitious program announced 2 or 3 years ago by the UN Secretary General, covering all countries in the globe. World Risk Poll covers 142 of them. Francis, what does this slide say to you? I should clarify also that the listing here is a listing and ranking of reach and access of communities of the priority countries of the UN Early Warning Initiative for support from the UN and its donors, whereas the findings here are global. So globally, right, 30% of people didn't get an early warning, right? So there is a slight distinction to be made there. Francis, what does this slide say to you? Yeah.
Yes, of course, there is the general understanding that a lot of people have access to mobile phones these days. It could be just the ordinary phone or digital. Where back home, I would say about a little over 50 or 60% of people, carry phones. And so there's the effort, really, by various state agencies to share relevant early warning, messages. Essentially, at the moment, it's around weather forecasting. Yeah. But essentially, there are a lot of dimensions to this. Firstly, in our society, we have a very high level of illiteracy. So the means by which some of the messages are communicated are actually in English, be it by mobile phones or on the radio or television. so it's mostly communicated via English. And so the question is, are they really comprehending the message? So one would then ask, is it that the 30 or so % who said they did not receive message fall within that category? Or is it also part of those who are outside of those who carry mobile phones, who do not carry mobile phones are within that bracket? So yes, so I think, the other thing probably that is really missed out in this is people with disability. Before I came here, we had an engagement with a set of a program that's actually trying to include people with disability in climate change issues. So one of the things that they really mentioned is that most, if not all, of the efforts around climate change, either development or intervention, whatever, are mostly not disability friendly. They are not disability inclusive. So also, they clearly mentioned, the issue around weather forecasting, for example, came up, and they say most of these forecasts are actually in a way that they cannot, engage with, So there's no form of braille, for example, for the visually impaired. I guess also even audiovisuals, are not loud enough probably for people with impaired. So there are all of these challenges. Probably the reflection of what we have is a combination, a composite of all of these people who fall outside of that. So I think really it speaks, and it's reflective of my society.
Thank you for those great insights that look well beyond that particular headline around the opportunity, which is clearly there for the use of mobile phone. Thank you so much, Francis. Zoe, what does the slide say to you in terms of your thinking on early warning? The World Bank operates a lot of early warning programming. You work in the urban space. Yes. So what are the implications of this slide for you?
No, so maybe just to mention, so the World Bank is, of course, it's a UN-led program, UNDRR, WMO, ITU, but the World Bank and other MDBs, of course, have signed on to support the early warning for all. And so in our last fiscal year, the World Bank alone provided about $1.3 billion in financing for early warning systems. What I would say, I agree 100% with Francis. So Francis stole some of my talking points, but I was going to mention in terms of inclusive early warning systems. But what I think is important to mention is also, so on the one hand, on the hydromet side and the early warning, so the governments also themselves need to prioritize and finance and think through how to do these systems, right? And so we can help them with that, but it's also up to them to sort of take that initiative and go forward with it. And clearly the data show that there's quite a big scope for improvement here. My guess is that the 70%, or at least the 70% who have early warning are probably in higher, I would guess, higher income countries, and probably the 30 are probably middle to lower, and especially, as Francis was saying, these marginalized communities are those who are not receiving the warning. And so, of course, you can improve the mobile technology, the digital warning, the information communication technology networks, the different protocols. But I think we're also looking more into what Francis was saying and trying to get into more the inclusive elements, the last mile, which is typically the gap, right? So making sure people who can understand the alert, maybe we're using a lot of common alert protocol that helps persons with hearing impairments, for example, or visual impairments, but it's thinking through and working with also understanding the community needs who have to receive and interpret the warning, and then of course what to do with that. So we have several examples. I don't think we have time to share, but just to say, I think it is, it's not just a technology problem, I think is my main point from what I interpret from the data.
Great, Zoe, thank you, yeah. And yes, the last mile, some of us call it the first mile. The Freetown flood fighting ladies are in the first mile. and they are the first respondents of the World Risk Poll. It's great that we do actually have some Met agencies in the room today. We have UK Met Office, but we also have a Met agency that ranks very high on the chart. Serendipitously, I bumped in my hotel into Dr. Musa Mustafa, the Deputy Director General of none other than the Met Agency, National Met Agency of Mozambique, INAMA. Musa, do come up. Welcome. Right, yes. Now, please tell us, right, how did you manage to ensure that you had such a high reach, right, high access of communities to early warnings? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Mike, for inviting me to join in this section. When I see that graph, I'm saying, okay, I think we are doing something good. As you know, that Mozambique is one of the countries most prone to disasters. I'm talking about tropical cyclones, floods. In the last years, we found that lightning is killing many people, and most of the Mozambicans are living in coastal area. So I'm coming from Met Service of Mozambique. It's one of the main organizations that produce the earnings to the public. And we work directly with a disaster management organization. What we do is that we developed a platform that we send directly our information to disaster management, and they produce short messages, and they have a database that with a list of a mobile phone for different, we have a local disaster communities. And with that platform, we disseminate our earnings in order that the area to be affected, they receive the information. We have the media, the normal media, that disseminate. So my colleague was talking about people with a disability. So last year, we started to talk with there's an organization in Mozambique with people with a disability, and they have their own television station. So we started now to provide the training, specific training, in order to understand our language and so on and so on. So I think mostly we work at that with the, you know, that the early warning for all, it the 4 pillars. One of the pillars is communication, and we work with the National Institute of Communication of Mozambique, who manage all the communication system. They have, I think, all phone numbers, and we can, from there, we know that they can send a specific message to a specific area. So it's what we are doing now, but of course we still have challenges. The number of the people in Mozambique is increasing, and but that's the way we use. So I feel happy in this room because I see Neri is the one who designed our strategic plan, and we are following that plan. I think we were improving bit by bit. Thank you, Mr. Mark. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. That's wonderful to hear, Musa. And that mix of the mobile phone-based technology system and really engaging with the media. And if you do look at the breakdown of the key channels, media is still above 50%. Social media is growing. Community organizations are very significant at something like 30% as well. And they maybe are sort of the key to unlocking this issue of how to help, for instance, very specific groups with disabilities, right? Because the Met agencies can't do it all, but I think the community intermediaries can actually help in a very significant way, and that is reflected very much so in the data. So we have very little time for questions. I think perhaps, gosh, we have a minute left. Let's at least have one question from our good colleague, Gavin White from REAP, the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership. Go, Gavin.
I'll try to keep it short.
Yes.
No, I'm from the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, and we're part of the privileged participants who are able to review this report. So I just want to really encourage everyone to read the report. It's a fascinating report. There's a wealth of data in there. And I just want to highlight 2 points. As you read through it, you will see areas of your own research that you'll be looking forward to. It's based on subjective perceptions, so I think you have to take a pinch of salt in comparing across countries. Early warning systems is well-known facts. Canada is not among the countries that considers it has a good early warning system, but Chad does. Doesn't mean that Chad is better than Canada. Not in this report globally, but I think it just means take some of these statistics with a pinch of salt. There's a cultural component as well. So you're mentioning, like, in Japan, people don't necessarily think their neighbors are always there for them. I think the expectations in Japan are much higher as to what a neighbor would be doing for you versus, for example, the US. So I think that cultural component is also critical. The fact that you're looking at discrimination, again, how have you been discriminated? People in the US may see that very different than someone who grew up in a caste society, for example, in some other countries. But in terms of future research, I want to encourage that there's a lot of wealth of, for example, the ways in which crises actually lead to a decrease of the overall perception in Eastern Europe, but not in the countries at war. So in Ukraine and Russia, there's actually an increase. What does that mean in terms of rally around the flag? There's all this really interesting insights in this report. So I really want to encourage everyone to look at that. And maybe a last point on the preparedness itself. Preparedness can mean that you've been through a disaster. It means you're actually feeling like you're more afraid, so maybe your perception of your ability to manage may be lower, but at the same time, you may be objectively better prepared because you actually have things stashed. So there's all these contradictory nuggets in this report, so please read it. I really like it. Congratulations.
Thank you, Gavin. To respect timings on the next session, that was the last comment. We will continue with the Q&A out in the corridor. In the meantime, I'm going to set you all some homework. The next World Risk Poll comes out in 2026, David. It will time broadly with the next Understanding Risk. Please go into the Data Explorer of the World Risk Poll. You will be working in a country on one of the dimensions, at least one of the dimensions. That's individual, household, community, social resilience. Think hard about the findings and try to find a way of improving those scores within 2 years, right, so that they're reflected in what we will discuss, I very much hope, in 2 years' time at the next UR. So thank you very much, everybody.